Boyfriend, Teenage Love. Written by Vella Jamar. Narrated by Deja, Nance. Chapter 2. As Marcus and I spent more time in the clubhouse, he began to educate me about sex as if he were some kind of expert. He said it was sperm that dripped, not liquid as I referred to it. He said it was a penis that was causing me so much pain, not organ as I expressed. I asked him one time why was it always pointing upwards, and he quickly explained because a woman's vagina, not tiwi as I described it, was upward, creating a perfect match. I didn't agree with him as far as the matching of our bodies was concerned. He was not the one on the painful receiving end. He could not possibly have grasped the agonizing experience of being gone into with something that was too big. He absolutely adored that clubhouse. I could barely get home from school, let alone get any homework done. He was starting to irk me, but I kept going whenever he'd asked. After we'd finish, he'd just talk, mostly about his father. He'd sit there and talk for what seemed like hours. I really didn't know what to say, and so I listened. His father passed away in a tragic drowning accident some years earlier. He used to show off a picture he carried in his wallet of the two of them when he was a little boy. He would gaze at the photograph telling me to look, as he'd proudly point to the two of them. He seemed to be in another world telling his story while I sat in his lap and listened. He treasured the picture as if it were a piece of gold. He'd sit there and say how he wished his father were still here. He said their birthdays were on the same day and would reminisce about the long trips he took them on to visit his family in Texas. He particularly liked talking of a trip they used to take to the Yosemite. He longed for a relationship with him and used to tell me how lucky I was to still have a father. I used to think to myself, boy, if you only knew. Though he was still alive, there was no relationship. He had 2 favorite kids even though we were a family of 8. It's as if he had no others. At least that was my opinion and how I felt. Some men are fathers and some are sperm donors, my cousin concluded after a few sessions with her therapist. Her father had rejected her completely. That certainly gave a new spin in describing one who refused to take care of business when it came to his offspring. Another clubhouse session, he said he was told many times as a child, just like your daddy, you aren't going to be any good. It obviously hurt him because he kept talking about it when we were together. Poor boy. People don't realize how damaging their words can be, especially to a child who either believes what has been told to him or her while it manifests in their life, or they overcome and do the exact opposite. He also talked of how he was told numerous times that he was retarded and stupid. He expressed that he felt unloved because he looked like his father, who was a downright womanizer. It was reputed that his dad had women coming out of the woodworks. He absolutely adored his father, and it meant something very special to him each time he bragged that their birthdays were on the same day. He must have told me 1,000 times. Another time, he talked of how he used to stay in his bird cage for hours talking to his pigeons, pretending that he was actually talking to his father. He said he missed him very much. He seemed so lonely inside. He had 2 sisters and 3 brothers. How lonely could he have been with all of that company? He and Raymond seemed close when we were outside playing. When he finished talking about his dad, he would carefully place the picture back inside of his wallet. He said his mother once sent a psychologist to talk to him in his bird cage because he refused to go to his office. He boasted of how he turned on the psychologist and started using some psychology on him. I used to think that because he was so attractive, he was automatically full of self-esteem. Not so, I would come to learn. One evening, Marcus came over and we walked down the street towards the corner. Without warning, he picked me up again and walked us toward the clubhouse. He carried me a good distance and about midway placed me back on the ground. He stood in front of me and hugged me tight under the bright street lights. It felt so good being wrapped in his strong arms as I tightly squeezed back. It was a new experience that I was rather enjoying with the exception of the painful body entrance. He smiled lovingly as he wrapped his arm around my waist and finished walking us to the clubhouse. After another excruciating entrance, we fell asleep forgetting all about school the next day, which we seemed to care less for as time went on. When we woke up, we dressed and he walked me home, where we ended the night in a passionate kiss, as we reluctantly let go of each other. One morning, we decided to ditch school together. After he had his fun, we walked to Nora's backyard, his neighbor, and then climbed a couple of fences to get to his backyard. He wanted to show me his birds. His mother's car wasn't in the driveway. I was baffled as to why we hadn't just walked to his backyard in the first place. All of his siblings should have been in school. He was about to show me when we heard his mother talking to the neighbor, and we hopped yet another fence and made our way to 11th Street, which is the block I lived on. We walked to the corner and parted for the day. Even though Marcus was from a single-parent household, his mother somehow managed to send him and his oldest brother to Catholic school. I don't know why it took so long to realize that money was being wasted on Marcus non-attending behind. He would eventually attend Richmond and Berkeley High. It wasn't as if he was dumb. He was very smart, as a matter of fact. Just had a lot of stuff on his mind that was hindering his intellectual growth. He used to always brag about how he was the smartest boy in class in math when he attended Woods Elementary School. I think all of that changed dramatically with the death of his father. Word around the neighborhood is that their papa was a rolling stone. That is just how they described him. He left behind quite a reputation. Marcus said on being introduced to an older gentleman almost 2 decades after his father's death, upon hearing his last name, looked at him and said, "Larry Ream's son," and went on to say, "Boy, your daddy had more women than you and I both have fingers and toes." Almost 30 plus years after his death, his grandson would report after some older fellows heard his last name, inquired was he related to the Larry Ream. When he responded in the positive, he said they sat him down and said, "Man, your granddaddy wasn't no joke," and told of some of his adventures while he was living. He was a legend being talked about decades after his death. The very mention of his name got people talking. He must have been a handsome hunk to have had so many women, in addition to having turned out 3 handsome chocolate brown sons. They all had perfect white teeth and were very attractive. One of his sisters had the same pretty teeth, but looked as though she ate all the food in the house. Marcus's portion for sure. She was fatter than Bluto, and poor Marcus was skinnier than Popeye the Sailor Man's girlfriend. All of his brothers seemed to be a normal size, but Marcus Ream had no meat on his bone. He was skinny. Brenda once commented how she used to think he looked like the Michael Jackson. Marcus used to relish talking about going places with his dad. He said they were really close, but when I met his grandmother years later, she said in his mind he wanted to be close to his dad, but that dad was a very busy man. She took a very special interest in Marcus and took on more of the mother role in his life than that of a grandmother. There was a very special bond between them. He loved her very dearly. I had never seen anything like it in all of my life. I used to think that maybe he was the son she could have wanted and never had. Whatever it was theirs, and no one was getting between what they had. Marcus came one evening just as I was about to call it a night. He picked me up and draped me across his shoulder, carrying me a little further than he had the first 2 times. He was strong. When he put me down, he challenged me to race him to the clubhouse. I wasn't in such a hurry to get there and took my sweet time walking. I was having a lot of fun with him. He talked, I listened. I was pretty withdrawn at the time and had welcomed the change in my otherwise depressing life. Sometimes we sat on different neighbors' porches and cuddled up real tight as we tried keeping each other warm. When he finished talking, he walked me home, and I went to my room and fell asleep dreaming about his fine, brown, handsome ass. Word was getting out that my old friend Trina was pregnant. Around that time, I too had missed my period, or so I thought. Anxious to tell him he was going to be a father too, I went looking for Marcus for a change. He was with his friend T when I caught up with him. I told him to come here. When he crossed the street where I stood, I told him, We need to talk about something you did. He must have known exactly what I was referring to and exclaimed, "Not so!" He knew he hadn't made the mistake of dripping even one drop of his sperm inside of me with the perfect jump he was still mastering. He promised to come by later, and off with tea he went. I walked home alone as I thought about the possibility of being a mother. The very idea had me terrified. What in the world would I do with a baby at such a young age? Maybe it was time for Trina and I to become friends again. We were going to be mommies after all. By the time he came a few days later, my menstruation had appeared. When I told him it was a false alarm, he hugged me. We were both relieved and agreed we better be even more careful in the future. We finished kissing as we had become accustomed to on my front porch. My monthly woman business had saved me from being torn into by Marcus Reen that evening. One evening in mid-September of 1976, before the fight between Trina and I occurred, we were on our way to Lisa's house. We were crossing the street when Glenn, our down-the-street neighbor, and his friend were driving in his dad's blue truck. Glenn yelled, "Let's go for a ride." We jumped in the back and they said, No, come up front." We climbed in and squeezed between them and drove off. They were some coochie freaks and just wanted sex. We drove to a secluded area, I believe in Point Richmond. When we stopped, I and his friend got out. Glenn and I had known each other for at least 5 years. I don't know how long he and Trina had been acquainted. His mother ran the neighborhood store. His friend and I talked outside in the cold before they decided we'd go to the camper, which sat on the side of Glenn's house. His friend and I climbed up to the bed part while Trina and Glenn stayed below. I refused each of his friends' passes. When they finished, Trina and I walked to the next block to go home. I had no idea at the time that she had conceived. Lorraine and I were still in touch by phone. Her whole family was full of humor. When the school district found out they were no longer living across the street, she was forced to change schools. We were so sad that we wouldn't be able to complete our education together. She had a very outgoing personality and a lot of friends to prove it. One night I was talking to her. We were glued by gossip. About Trina being pregnant, the whole neighborhood was talking, not to mention all of the people at school. I told her and her sister Pat, who was on the other phone, that Trina and I were with Glenn and his friend the night that she got pregnant, and all those fellows wanted to do was to do it. Pat, with her inquiring mind, wanted to know specifically, "Do what?" I replied, "Do the nasty," as we burst into laughter. I told them how we had gone riding one night and ended up going to the trailer on the side of Glenn's house. They also knew Glenn and his family from the neighborhood. While we were catching up on other gossip, Marcus knocked on the door. He patiently stood outside while I tried wrapping up the endless chatting. After about 15 minutes, he grew impatient. He came inside the house, took the phone, and told them, "She'll call back later," and hung up. I hadn't got a chance to tell them that I too had started doing it myself with and to Marcus. They knew him from the neighborhood as well. After my baby hung up the phone, he led me to his favorite kissing spot on our porch. We kissed for a few moments. He then wrapped his arm around me while guiding us down the steps. We walked down the street and sat on one of our neighbors' porch that was fuller than my porch and hugged real tight, trying to keep each other warm from the fierce cold wind. We enjoyed being together. It was a lot more pleasant and painless than being in that clubhouse. He was beautiful to look at with his big brown eyes and white pearly smile. He kept telling me, "I love you," as we sat and gazed at each other. I wanted to say it back, a few times anyway, but it just wouldn't come out. I really was beginning to love him. It was getting late. We wrapped up our kissing bout, and he walked me back home. We used the clubhouse quite frequently, but we didn't always go. We stayed on the porch a few more minutes, leaning into the rail, kissing, and then hugged a final time before saying goodnight. He went home, and I zipped upstairs and went to bed. Storm, snow, rain, nor lightning could keep Marcus away from that clubhouse. One day, he came with his umbrella, and we walked to his favorite place. It was cold, As we lay down, it seemed like the raindrops found every crack in the roof. He moved the bed several times to dodge the raindrops. We got under the covers trying to keep warm. As much as he declared his love for me, he wanted to hurt me again by putting himself inside. He jumped up when it was time to release. We were not interested in being parents at that time. He cleaned himself up and laid back down beside me as we wrapped the cover around trying to keep out the cold. Though Marcus was from a single-parent household, I would say behind Olita's family, their car lined up as the second best on that block. Olita was Trina and Judy's cousin as well as Brenda's baby sister. Marcus's family's car was big enough for their entire family, including their grandmother, who seemed to be a constant presence in their camp. Whenever Marcus wanted to go to the clubhouse in the daytime, we went from 12th Street if that big blue car was absent from their driveway, or if none of the other kids were playing near Juan's house. Most of the time they played in front of Olita's house. We were extremely sneaky. If the car was visible, or if kids were near Juan's house, then we'd walk to 13th Street and climb the fence to go to the clubhouse, all to avoid running into his mother or anyone else for that matter. I didn't know his mother, and I'd mostly seen her behind the steering wheel of their blue car or in the neighborhood. Trina said she was a real fast lady soon after her husband died, and then suddenly became Mrs. Church. I really don't know how in the world we were able to spend so much time in that clubhouse because they attended church 8 days a week. Every time I saw his family, it was the car full of them driving to or from church. They were always dressed up and crunched up in the car. Years later, his mother told me they'd be in the car actually complaining about being touched or breathed upon by one another. Some of the other kids said she was mean. I really didn't know her or much about her, and I and Marcus' earlier days, except for the few things others said about her. Each Sunday after they came home from church, Marcus walked to the store in his favorite rust-colored outfit. He even had some rust-colored rope-heeled shoes to match. He had it on every Sunday. I saw him and acted as though it were the only outfit he owned. The colors were perfect for his skin tone. He knew he looked good and wanted to make sure he was seen in his church clothes before he changed into play clothes. He was all the more handsome when he was dressed up. Right before me and Marcus started sinning, I was contemplating baptism. I was all set and ready to go until he came messing up everything. God works in mysterious ways. One day I opened my Bible to study and stumbled across Ephesians 5 verse 3, which reads, "But fornication and all uncleanness or covetousness, let it not even be named among you, as is fitting for saints." Fornication. It got my attention, and I ran to the dictionary to look it up. Though the definition was pretty obvious, I did not want to accept what I read. I then called the minister, who confirmed, yes, it meant exactly what I was still hoping it wouldn't. Sex outside of marriage was not a part of God's agenda in relation to Christian living. I don't know why I chose him over God. I would surely live to regret it. As abruptly as I began going to church, I suddenly stopped. I wasn't getting anything out of the sex. Maybe I was enjoying his company if nothing else. Anything that would take me away from my gloomy life, I guess. I was lonely, depressed, and a very unhappy individual right before Marcus came into my life. Though I or he changed my mind about getting baptized for the moment, I still attended church before giving up completely. I was actually starting to enjoy being there. I loved Marcus and knew that he loved me too in his own way, but we broke the perfect plan that God had for our lives by committing fornication. I felt guilty for not dedicating my life to God. One morning during Bible class, a girl asked theoretically, "What if my boyfriend wanted to stop by a motel on the way home from a movie, not necessarily wanting to do anything?" The teacher, who was an absolute Christian if I ever knew one, knew exactly where she was going and responded in a biblical manner. She explained that the only reason a guy would even want to go to a motel is for one thing and one thing only: She also told her that a young Christian woman basically had no business being in a motel with someone other than her husband. She was probably in the same dilemma I was, that being committing fornication or contemplating it. It always pays to do as God say, like God say to do it. One Sunday evening, I was getting ready to walk home from church when someone called my name. I walked to the car that was sitting in front of our church and realized it was the blue car Marcus and I carefully looked for in his driveway before stealing away to our love nest. Marcus and his two younger brothers were sitting in the car. We talked briefly. They said they were waiting for their mother, who was inside of our church. They attended one of those holy roly churches with people shouting and jumping everywhere when they got happy. I've seen some lose total control while doing their holy dance all over the church house. Years later, I visited their church and a lady literally fell out as she lay on the floor while others fanned her. I asked his mother what happened and she said the Holy Spirit had come over her to the point that she was overwhelmed with experiencing the presence of the Holy Ghost. I believe is how she explained it. Yeah, right, I thought to myself. I think she just ran out of juice with all of that fast dancing she was doing trying to keep up with the fast music. Some of those people really get off into their rituals. After we got older, Marcus and I wandered off sinful beings in there one evening. That night he was hit with the Holy Ghost, for the moment anyway. He was really off into it as he got blessed with the holy oil, asked for prayer, and even went into silent lip movement as he stood around the circle. I don't know what in the world he was mumbling, but I just sat back and looked at him. He was really in a trance. They were having some kind of revival. He left acting as if he hadn't even participated and got back into whatever sin he was in at the time, forgetting all about what he had just gone through. He was really trying to impress his mother that night. After they finished their jumping rituals, I opted to pass when they tried to put some olive oil on my forehead. My skin was greasy enough. We belonged to the very simple Church of Christ, which is the only one I've ever seen listed in the Bible, Romans 16:16. The only one that Jesus Christ died for, which carries his name. I'm still baffled when people say there's nothing in the name in reference to which name goes on the building. The Bible reads, "On this rock I will build my church." My equals possession, Matthew 16:18. We exchanged a few words as I smiled at my boyfriend, sitting in the car grinning like a chess cat. I should have asked for a ride. We didn't have an operable car at the time, which was the reason I was walking in the first place. We finished conversing and said goodbye. I left walking several blocks to get home. I used to hate church at one point, and remember the talk Grandma Pearlie had with me about God when I was a little girl, during a brief spell we lived with her. She talked to me for what seemed like hours, because she knew I did not like going. I used to pretend to have lost my shoe just so I wouldn't have to go. She said, "Tandy, if you don't do anything else, just go and sing. Your understanding of what God is all about will open up eventually." I was trying to get into the singing, hoping everything else would fall into place. Marcus got everything all out of order when he came to share his sinful being with me. This has been Boyfriend, Teenage Love, written by Vella Jamar, narrated by Deja Nance.